Welcome back to Evie's Acres. I'm Evie, and earlier this week, I posted a short video asking whether grit and calcium supplements like oyster shells are really necessary for free-ranging hens. In today's Homestead Health Hack video, let's talk about grit and calcium for chickens. First of all, what is chicken or poultry grit? Grit is comprised of small pieces of coarse material that chickens eat to aid in digestion, and in the case of calcium grit, hens will consume it to strengthen their eggshells. There are two general types of grit: insoluble grit and soluble grit. Insoluble grit is usually made from pieces of flint or granite. Chickens don't have teeth and must consume this type of grit daily to mechanically break down food in an organ called the gizzard. Since this type of grit will not be absorbed into the body, it must be the appropriate size for the chicken to ensure that it functions properly to aid digestion. Soluble grit is commonly made from limestone or oyster shells, which contain calcium carbonate that's needed to form eggshells in laying hens. Another source of soluble grit for a calcium supplement that I have used in the past is crushed baked eggshells. I know it sounds strange, but it really does work. After using the egg whites and yolks from the eggs, I'll rinse out the inner shell and allow them to air dry until I collect enough to form a single layer of eggshells on a baking sheet. Then I'll place them in the oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit for about 5 to 10 minutes or until they're completely dry. Then I'll crush them up and store them in an airtight container until I'm ready to feed it to the chickens. Do not feed raw eggshells to chickens because you do not want them to get into the habit of eating their eggs before you have a chance to collect them. As I mentioned a moment ago, it is important to make sure that the size of the grit is appropriate for the size of the chicken. Chick grit is appropriate for chicks under 8 weeks old. Grower grit is for chickens between 8 to 20 weeks old, and layer grit is for laying hens that are at least 20 weeks old. Note that if you are raising broilers, that is chickens for meat, then you will use the chick grit until they're only 4 weeks old and then switch over to the grower grit until they're processed. This is because meat chickens will typically grow much faster than the non-meat birds. Do chickens need insoluble grit if they free range all day? It is certainly possible for chickens to consume enough insoluble grit while free ranging. There is no guarantee, though, that the soil composition will contain an adequate amount of grit to support their digestive needs, so it's still a good idea to provide your flock with access to supplemental grit. And for laying hens, is soluble grit really necessary? Yes, soluble calcium-rich grit is essential to ensure strong eggshell production. A complete layer feed typically contains sufficient calcium for laying hens. However, if you feed your hens treats that can dilute the amount of calcium they ingest, so providing them with free access to calcium grit can help balance out their diet. How do I feed grit to my chickens? I have fed grit to my chickens as part of their feed by mixing it into their crumbles when they're young or in their pellets when they're older. This method is pretty easy to do, but beware that most of the grit will likely end up on the ground at first. Although I have found that eventually they end up eating it off of the ground anyway, whenever they need it. Another option is to use a grit feeder, which you can purchase from the store, make yourself, or you can repurpose a sturdy container that can hold the grit. It just needs to be easily accessible to the chickens and also sturdy enough to avoid being knocked over by the chickens. Now let's take a look at 5 benefits of grit for chickens. First, grit acts as a grinding agent in the gizzard, as I mentioned earlier, by aiding in the mechanical breakdown of grains and fibrous materials that chickens consume, like grass. This helps to keep the gizzard healthy and functioning optimally, which promotes overall digestive health. Next, due to this breakdown of food, proper digestion facilitated by grit helps chickens absorb essential nutrients more efficiently from their food. Another key benefit of grit for chickens is crop health. The crop is a muscular bag at the bottom of a chicken's neck that stores food that the chicken ingests throughout the day. Ingesting grit helps prevent crop impaction, which is a condition where food doesn't pass through the crop properly, leading to potential health issues. For example, sour crop is a condition where food will ferment in the crop, causing additional digestive issues, and frankly, that condition smells really, really bad. Grit is also helpful in preventing overeating in your flock. The grit in the gizzard creates a sensation of fullness, helping to regulate feed intake and prevent overconsumption. Finally, as mentioned earlier, calcium grit contributes to strong eggshells by providing an additional source of calcium for laying hens. I hope you found this video helpful and will share it with others who may be curious about the role of grit in chickens' diet. If you are an aspiring chicken keeper wondering what it takes to raise them, click the link in the description to assess your readiness to raise your first flock. Thanks again for watching this video, and until next time.